Hi guys, tonight we ease into a quiet story about forgotten knowledge. A story that begins with something as simple as an old log cabin, yet opens into a world of engineering instincts, slow craftsmanship, and practical wisdom that somehow modern construction lost along the way. And before we step fully into that world, I want to gently welcome you, wherever you are listening from, and invite you to let me know in the comments what city or country you're listening from tonight, because I love seeing how far this sleepy little community reaches. And if you enjoy these calm, deep dives, feel free to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And now, if you're ready, we let the noise of the modern world drift away and step quietly into a winter centuries old. You might look at an old log cabin and see nothing more than a rustic little structure, a place people rent for a weekend when they want to pretend they're living the simple life. But researchers in Finland recently saw something entirely different, something that almost seemed to break the rules of physics. And the story begins on a morning where the outside world hangs at -30 degrees, the kind of cold that bites into your skin and turns every breath into a small cloud of ice. Inside that 200-year-old cabin lives an 82-year-old woman named Helme, moving slowly but comfortably through her morning, even though the fire in her masonry heater had gone out 18 hours earlier, leaving nothing but cold ash in the hearth. No electricity, no backup heat, just the cabin and the winter. And yet she feels no distress, no shivering, no signs of danger. The researchers arrive with thermal cameras, expecting to find the floor freezing cold, expecting to see heat escaping upward, as we all learned it should. But when they point the camera at the floor, they freeze in place. The floor glows at 71 degrees Fahrenheit, while the ceiling shows only 58, a complete reversal of what modern physics predicts. Because if heat rises, the ceiling should be the warmest part of the room, and yet here the warmth sits exactly where a human body needs it most. Meanwhile, the modern house next door, built in 1985 with electric heat running all night, shows the opposite. A hot ceiling, a cold floor, and an owner wrapped under blankets, shivering despite paying $340 in heating for the month. And yet Helma wakes up comfortable, walks barefoot on warm boards, and pays nothing at all. This 200-year-old cabin outperforms modern engineering, not through insulation, not through advanced materials, but through 6 interconnected systems that medieval builders understood deeply. Systems modern construction abandoned in favor of continuous energy consumption. And the first of those systems begins with something most people never think twice about: the labyrinth that captures fire. Because if you watch smoke rise from a modern fireplace, you'll see it shoot straight upward, disappearing in seconds. And if you step outside and gently touch the chimney while the fire burns, you'll find it hot, sometimes too hot to keep your hand there. And that heat is energy escaping, leaving your home warming the sky instead of you. And this is why a roaring modern fireplace can actually make a room colder by pulling heated room air up the chimney faster than the flames can replace it. But if you travel back to rural Russia around the year 1650, you'll find a completely different solution, because winter there lasted 7 months, firewood was precious, and no one could afford to waste even a single stick. So they built something called a peck, a massive brick structure 8 feet tall that lived inside the home. And the design was so counterintuitive that modern engineers struggle to believe it at first glance. The smoke doesn't go straight up. Instead, it enters a maze, rising into the first chamber, striking a wall, forced sideways through an 8-foot brick channel, then downward through another 8 feet, then sideways again, up again, and sideways once more, winding through 32 feet of channels before finally reaching the chimney. And by the time the smoke escapes, its temperature has dropped from 1400 degrees to 85, because every inch of brick surface along those winding channels pulls heat from it, storing that warmth inside 4,000 pounds of masonry. Touch the outside of the chimney during a burn and it feels barely warm, because almost all the heat stayed inside the home, captured by the mass that radiates gentle warmth for the next 24 hours. And the Russians knew, without thermometers, without calculators, that those 32 feet were perfect, because if the smoke moved too fast, it escaped without transferring heat, and if it moved too slowly, it cooled inside the channels and caused tar buildup that blocked the system completely. They had found, through centuries of trial and error, the exact smoke velocity that produced maximum heat transfer, a number modern engineers only rediscovered recently. And when you compare it to a modern high-efficiency fireplace optimized for fast draft, you begin to see how much knowledge has been lost, because medieval heaters capture 80% of fire energy, while modern certified stoves capture 60 at best. And that forgotten knowledge doesn't stop at the fire. It continues right beneath your feet, into a system that affects your comfort more than any thermostat ever could, because the human body has 72,000 nerve endings in the feet, and when the floor is cold, the body perceives the entire environment as dangerous, regardless of what the air temperature says. Medieval builders in Scandinavia understood this without medical research, so they created floors that remained warm long after the fire died, using layers of heavy logs, packed sand, clay, and thick planks, building a structure that weighed 14 tons under the walking surface. And when the masonry heater sat directly on that mass, the heat seeped downward all day, storing itself in the sand and releasing it slowly through the night, maintaining a surface temperature around 70 degrees for 18 hours after the last flame faded. And this is only the beginning. And this is only the beginning, because even perfect heat capture and warm floors mean nothing if the moment you open your front door, a river of cold air crashes into your home and steals half your comfort in a few seconds, a problem so familiar in modern houses that most people simply accept it as unavoidable. Yet medieval builders knew how to stop it completely, and they did it with something so simple and so clever that once you see it, you wonder how we ever forgot it. In the far north of Sweden, inside a cabin built in 1680, and still lived in today, the entryway looks strange to modern eyes, because instead of a single door, there are two, with a small unheated space between them, no bigger than 4 feet by 4 feet, just enough for one person to step inside and close the door behind them before they open the second one. And this tiny space serves a purpose so crucial that northern families once considered it as important as the roof itself. Because when you stand outside in -20, you open the outer door, step into the little room, close it behind you, and suddenly the wind is gone. The biting cold is contained, and even though the air in that room might still be around 40 degrees, it is a middle ground, a buffer, a soft landing where the extreme cold cannot rush straight into the warm living space. And because of the tight angles, you physically cannot open the inner door until the outer door is closed, a detail designed intentionally, a kind of thermal discipline enforced by architecture. A Minnesota family tested this with 2 identical small cabins, both with the same insulation, same layout, same thermostat settings, and one had the double-door airlock while the other had a standard single entry. By the end of winter, the single-door cabin had burned through $920 of heating, while the airlock cabin had used $640, a difference of $280 saved simply by preventing cold air from rushing inside. But the design goes deeper, because the outer door opens outward, pushed shut tighter by the wind, while the inner door opens inward, sealed by the positive air pressure from warm air rising inside the house. And modern mudrooms fail to replicate this, because they are heated, which destroys the buffer effect entirely. A true airlock must be cold, must be unheated, must exist as a middle temperature zone that catches winter before it touches your living room. And while that protects your home from cold air entering, medieval builders also worked to ensure heat didn't escape through the very walls themselves, because the difference between a modern wall and a log wall is the difference between a thin barrier and a battery, one that actively stores heat during the day and releases it slowly at night, smoothing out the wild swings in temperature that make modern houses feel inconsistent even when the thermostat never changes. If you touch the wall of a modern home during a cold snap, You'll often feel the temperature shift hour by hour because drywall over air cavities over insulation behaves like a shell, thin and hollow, blocking heat but storing almost none of it, and as outside temperatures fall, the wall cools quickly, which means your furnace has to fight constantly to maintain comfort. But if you touch the wall of a log cabin built with 10-inch timbers, you feel something entirely different, a kind of slow, steady warmth, because the wall is not just resisting heat flow but storing it, absorbing sunlight during the day or warmth from the heater in the morning, holding that energy deep inside the wood fibers, and then releasing it gradually as outside temperatures plunge. Swedish researchers tested this in 2017 by building two identical structures, one with modern framing and insulation, the other with solid log walls, and over 2 weeks of February weather, where daytime temperatures hit the low 20s and nighttime temperatures dropped to -20, the modern structure experienced 15-degree swings inside, even with heating running, while the log structure moved only 3 degrees in total, barely shifting, calm and steady, like a massive thermal flywheel smoothing out constant fluctuations. And the effect becomes even more dramatic over multi-day cold snaps. In Norway, a research team monitored 2 homes during a 3-day freeze, one modern and one traditional, and while the modern home's heating system ran nearly 18 hours per day trying to maintain comfort, the old log cabin's heater burned for just 2 hours each morning, with the thick walls capturing enough heat to release it for the next 22 hours, keeping the interior at a steady, livable temperature without expensive systems or continuous fuel. But temperature is only one part of comfort, because air itself, the quality, the moisture, the feel of every breath changes, depending on the materials your home is made of. And this is where medieval builders held another quiet advantage that modern architecture erased almost completely. Step into a modern home in January, heating running, windows sealed, and take a deep breath. Your throat dries, your nose stings, your lips tighten, the humidity gauge reads 22%, lower than many deserts, and your body feels the effects: irritated eyes, static shocks, dry skin, nosebleeds in the morning, a subtle discomfort many people think is just normal winter air. But step into a cabin with exposed wood walls in the same conditions, and the air feels different immediately. It has weight, softness, balance, the kind of natural humidity that feels comfortable without any machines running, because solid wood walls absorb moisture when air gets too humid and release it when air gets too dry, keeping the indoor humidity in the healthy 40 to 55% range automatically, without humidifiers, without vents, without electricity. A Vermont family restored an 18th century log cabin and monitored it for a year. Humidity stayed between 42 and 48% in winter, without any systems running, while their modern home next door required a humidifier in winter, a dehumidifier in summer, and constant maintenance, filters and energy to keep it livable. And wood does one more thing modern walls cannot. It cleans the air, absorbing volatile organic compounds, things like paint fumes, adhesives, carpet off-gassing, trapping them inside its fibers so you no longer breathe them. Something Finnish researchers confirmed when they measured identical furniture in modern homes versus log cabins and found 30% lower levels of volatile compounds in the wooden structures. People often say old cabins feel healthy, but it isn't nostalgia. It is measurable, physical air quality improvement happening silently around you. And after all these systems, heat capture, mass storage, humidity control, there is one final detail, so simple it sits almost invisible, yet so effective that medieval builders followed it with absolute consistency. The placement of the heater itself. Because if you walk into a modern living room, you'll almost always see the fireplace set proudly against an exterior wall, the chimney visible from the street, framed as a decorative feature rather than a functional one. And yet, this placement quietly sabotages the entire heating system, allowing a quarter of the generated heat to flow straight outdoors through the wall behind it, disappearing into the cold night instead of circulating into the room where people actually live. Now step inside a restored medieval cabin, or a traditional Scandinavian homestead built before industrial architecture took over, and look for the heater. You won't find it on an outer wall at all. You'll find it tucked deep into an interior corner, pressed between two inside surfaces, protected from the cold and positioned, so that every side radiates warmth into the living space, rather than losing energy to the weather outside. A choice that feels obvious once you see it, yet is almost never done in modern construction. Swedish architects studying 40 surviving medieval structures found that every single one placed its primary heat source in an interior corner, not one against an exterior wall, and this was not an accident or a stylistic preference. It was a refined, centuries-tested decision rooted in understanding how heat actually behaves. Because corners are naturally the coldest parts of a room, two walls meeting creates a point where heat escapes more easily, creating cold spots, condensation, and even mold in modern homes. By placing the warmest object in that coldest point, medieval builders inverted the problem, filling the cold corner with steady radiant heat, eliminating condensation entirely, preventing mold and stabilizing the temperature of the entire room in one elegant move. Something modern architects often try to fix with dehumidifiers, vents, and insulation. Yet medieval builders solved with nothing more than placement and instinct. And when you look at all 6 systems together, the smoke labyrinth that captures nearly every bit of fire energy, the massive floors that store heat like a thermal battery, the airlock entry that stops winter from rushing inside, the thick log walls acting as a thermal flywheel smoothing temperature swings, the wood's natural humidity regulation and air purification, and the precise placement of the heater in the home's warmest interior zone, you begin to see how these designs were never isolated tricks but pieces of a coherent philosophy. A philosophy built from observation, necessity, and the quiet patience of people who could not afford to waste fuel, who lived inside their buildings as intimately as we live with our phones, who understood comfort not through digital thermostats, but through the feel of warm floors under bare feet at dawn, the taste of fresh humidified air without machines humming in the background, the steady warmth of walls that breathed and held the memory of yesterday's fire. These weren't primitive solutions, they were resilient ones, solutions that continued to function when wind blew, when the grid failed, when temperatures dropped for days. Solutions that modern homes dependent on electricity, on forced air systems, on thin walls filled with materials that store nothing, simply cannot replicate without continuous energy input. And what makes all of this even more remarkable is that none of these builders had engineering degrees. None ran computer simulations, none had access to digital tools or laboratory data. They had time, they had winters that demanded precision, and they had generation after generation observing, adjusting, correcting, refining, until a set of principles emerged that worked not just for years but for centuries. Because that cabin where Helmi lives, the one where the floor remains warm 18 hours after the last flame goes out, still performs exactly as it did 200 years ago, without a single renovation, without modern insulation, without a furnace, without a thermostat, without a monthly bill, functioning solely through physics applied with deep human intuition. And it reminds us that sometimes knowledge fades not because it was wrong, but because it was too slow, too thoughtful, too incompatible with the speed at which modern construction wants to operate. And as you listen to this story, maybe already feeling your breathing slow, maybe letting the thoughts settle that comfort in a home is not just about temperature but stability, softness, rhythm and balance, you might begin to imagine how many little details in the buildings around us were lost, simply because they couldn't be mass-produced quickly, and how many of them, like these 6 forgotten systems, are still waiting quietly in the past for us to pick them up again. Because for many people in cold climates today, one winter storm can knock out power for days, and modern homes collapse into freezing shells without electricity, while medieval cabins with no grid, no wires, no machines were designed to maintain life and warmth through the very worst of weather, holding heat like a living organism that breathed with its occupants. And in a soft, almost ironic way, these ancient structures feel strangely futuristic, pointing toward a world where comfort and resilience don't depend on technology, but on understanding the laws of physics at a human pace, and on accepting that sometimes the simplest materials, wood, sand, brick, stone, can outperform the most complex systems when arranged with patience and purpose. And as we move deeper into this quiet investigation of forgotten comfort, it becomes clearer that these 6 systems were never simply construction tricks, but expressions of an older relationship between humans and their homes, a relationship built not on convenience but on cooperation, because in those long northern winters a building was not merely a shelter, it was a partner in survival, a silent companion that held warmth, softened air, captured fire, and protected life through nights when temperatures fell so low that even the breath from your lungs could freeze in the air. Imagine, for a moment, standing in the doorway of a cabin built 2 centuries ago, the sun setting early behind a ridge of frozen pines, the snow outside glowing faint blue in that strange hush that winter carries, and the door closing behind you with that heavy wooden thud, warm air brushing your face even though no fire has burned there since midday, the floor radiating a soft heat that feels almost like sunlight held inside the boards, the walls breathing gently, the air neither dry nor heavy but perfectly balanced, and you realize that the entire home is still releasing the memory of a single small fire lit hours ago. This slow, steady rhythm of warmth is something modern heating systems struggle to replicate, because forced air systems blast hot air that rises immediately to the ceiling, leaving your feet cold, your head warm, and the room filled with constant fluctuations, a cycle of overheating and cooling, a feeling of chasing comfort instead of settling into it, while the old log cabin gives you something closer to a heartbeat, a pulsing, even warmth that moves through the mass of the home itself. In the 2021 Texas freeze, millions of modern homes dropped to freezing temperatures in a matter of hours, once the power grid collapsed, because with nothing to heat the air and no mass to store warmth, the cold penetrated every surface rapidly, and families scrambled to recreate, with blankets under doors and candles in corners, what older structures had designed into their architecture permanently, a reminder that resilience is not built overnight, but slowly, layer by layer, through systems that do not fail when electricity does. And while modern building codes obsess over R values, measurements of how slowly heat passes through a material, they ignore something far more powerful: thermal capacity, the amount of heat a material can store, because a wall that resists heat loss but stores nothing will still let a home swing rapidly in temperature, while a massive log wall with moderate insulation but enormous storage smooths those swings into gentle curves that the human body experiences as comfort. In many ways, the old cabins behave like living things, absorbing energy when it's abundant, releasing it when it's scarce, adjusting humidity as needed, cleaning the air as a forest would, slowing the movement of heat like a giant lung breathing in and out across the span of a day. And once you see a home this way, as a living participant rather than a static structure, you begin to understand why these buildings last centuries without losing their function. There's something deeply peaceful about that, something reassuring, as if the builders weren't just constructing walls, but teaching the material how to behave, how to listen to the climate, how to respond without instruction, and the idea that a building could remember warmth or balance humidity sounds poetic, yet it is simply physics carried out by natural materials at their own unhurried pace. And perhaps that's the real secret behind all of this. The slowness, the patience, the refusal to rush the process, because every piece of these heating systems relied on observing natural behavior, whether it was the way smoke curled inside a chamber, or how long sand stayed warm under a layer of planks, or how moisture moved in and out of wooden fibers. And these builders trusted their senses, their winters, their elders, slowly refining, slowly improving, until the homes they built were not just shelters, but systems of resilience encoded in timber and stone. Even now, when researchers restore old log cabins and measure their performance with modern instruments, they find that the builders centuries ago were not guessing. They were correct in ways that align almost perfectly with thermodynamics and heat transfer principles that wouldn't be formally described for hundreds of years. And this accuracy, this intuitive engineering, reveals a kind of intelligence shaped by survival rather than technology. And it makes you wonder how many other quiet solutions lie hidden in the past, buried beneath layers of convenience and speed, waiting for someone curious enough to notice them again. Just like the Finnish team who stepped into Helma's cabin with their thermal cameras and found a world that contradicted everything they thought they knew. A world where the floor was warmer than the ceiling, where the walls held the warmth of a fire long extinguished, where the air remained gentle and balanced without a single machine running. As you keep listening, maybe your mind drifts a little, imagining the soft orange glow of a brick heater long after midnight, the faint crackle of ice outside, the sense of being wrapped not only in a house but in a system designed to cradle you gently through the coldest seasons. And perhaps you begin to feel the calm that comes from knowing that resilience doesn't have to be complex. It can be built slowly, thoughtfully, in wood and clay and sand, with decisions that respect physics instead of fighting it. And somewhere in that quiet, you understand that what medieval builders created was not nostalgia, not primitive architecture, but a blueprint for comfort that the modern world has largely forgotten. And as we drift further into this exploration, it becomes clear that medieval builders were not simply constructing shelters to survive the cold, but shaping entire microclimates inside their homes, crafting environments where temperature, moisture, airflow, and radiant heat blended into a single consistent experience, the kind that allows a person to sleep through the longest winter nights without waking from sudden chills or restless overheating. Something modern homes, with all their technology, still struggle to get right. Because when you live inside a structure with thermal mass, walls that store heat, floors that radiate gently, a heater positioned to distribute warmth evenly across every dimension of the room, the body no longer fights the environment, no longer detects oscillations of temperature as threats, no longer constricts blood vessels in your feet, or sets off stress responses that make winter feel harsh and exhausting. Instead, the entire space moves in a slow, predictable rhythm, one the body recognizes instinctively as safety. And this safety is not just physical but psychological, because warmth that lingers through the night carries with it a sense of continuity, as if the home itself is awake while you sleep, tending to the temperature, absorbing the cold seeping in from outside, releasing heat steadily across the hours until morning, creating an unbroken thread of comfort that modern heating systems, with their sharp cycles and abrupt blasts of hot air, cannot replicate without constant energy input. Many of the families who still live in centuries-old log cabins describe this feeling in simple words. They say the house feels alive, or that the warmth feels soft, or that winter feels less aggressive. And these descriptions match exactly what researchers have begun to measure with instruments: reduced temperature swings, consistent humidity, lower concentrations of airborne chemicals, and surfaces that remain warm long after heat production ends, all combining to create an environment where the human body feels naturally at ease. Even the way air moves in these old structures contributes to comfort, because the thick walls and heavy floors change the way convection forms inside a room, slowing down turbulent air currents, preventing drafts at the ankles, and allowing pockets of warmth to settle where the body can use them most, rather than rising quickly to the ceiling and accumulating above your head, which is what happens in thin-walled modern homes. And then there is the sound, the quiet, because the mass of wood absorbs vibration, muting the harshness of winter winds outside, softening footsteps, reducing echoes and creating a cocoon-like sense of enclosure, the feeling that the world outside can rage and howl while inside everything remains steady, calm, wrapped in layers of material that have held stories, storms, and warmth for generations. It is almost poetic how these structures perform during moments of crisis. when power grids fail or sudden cold waves sweep across entire regions. Because while modern buildings begin losing heat in hours, their walls cooling like thin metal left out in the night, the old log cabins continue radiating heat slowly and faithfully, buying families time, preserving comfort without electricity, proving that resilience is not a modern invention, but something we once knew instinctively and built directly into the places we lived. And when researchers tested old masonry heaters, floors, walls, and airlocks side by side with modern counterparts, they found that the cabins outperformed modern homes in nearly every category, not just by small margins but by enormous ones. And this forced them to confront a difficult question: not why medieval people built this way, because survival demanded it, but why we stopped. The answer, they realized, wasn't that modern builders found a better method, but that they found a faster one, a cheaper one, a method that works perfectly as long as electricity flows endlessly, as long as fuel is abundant, as long as you are willing to accept higher heating bills in exchange for quicker construction. And somewhere along the line, the older principles were simply pushed aside, not disproven but forgotten. And when Helm's cabin appeared on the thermal cameras, with its warm floor and its cool ceiling, with its stability, its memory, its gentle protection from the cold, it served as a kind of reminder, a quiet message from the past saying that we once knew how to build homes that partnered with us, instead of relying on systems that fail as soon as the grid flickers, homes where physics and materials did the work without constant intervention. As the camera panned across the room, showing the soft blue of the ceiling and the warm amber glow of the floorboards, the researchers realized they were looking not at an anomaly but at a blueprint, one that had been sitting in front of humanity for centuries, one that we had walked away from without ever noticing the consequences, until winter storms and rising energy costs forced us to look back. And maybe, as you listen to this story now, slowly sinking deeper into your own sense of rest, letting your breath soften and your eyelids grow heavier, you begin to understand that the wisdom of these old cabins was never about technology at all, but about alignment, aligning homes with the human body, with the climate, with the flow of heat and air, with the quiet intelligence of natural materials. And in that realization, there is something soothing, something grounding, something that lets you settle deeper into your pillow, knowing that resilience doesn't always require complexity. Sometimes it simply requires remembering. And as this understanding settles in, like embers glowing beneath the ash long after the fire fades, it becomes clear that the story of medieval heating is not just a tale of old buildings, but a reflection of how humans once lived with the natural world instead of against it, shaping structures that worked with the cold rather than trying to overpower it with brute force, and in doing so creating homes that felt more like companions than machines. Because when you look closely at the way these 6 forgotten systems overlap, the labyrinth that captures fire, the massive floors that store warmth, the airlock that blocks winter, the log walls that act as thermal flywheels, the wood that breathes humidity in and out, and the heater tucked safely into an interior corner, you begin to see a pattern of choices made slowly and intentionally, choices guided by observation, patience, and the steady rhythm of life lived through countless winters. This rhythm is something modern architecture rarely considers, because our buildings are designed for speed of construction, speed of heating, speed of cooling, everything immediate and reactive, everything dependent on electricity responding instantly to commands. And while this speed feels convenient, it creates an internal environment that is always moving, swinging, adjusting, never resting long enough for the body to truly relax. But in a medieval log cabin, the rhythm was slow, deliberate, stable. A 2-hour fire in the morning giving warmth for the entire day, a floor radiating gentle heat through the afternoon, and far into the night, walls smoothing the difference between sunshine and darkness, humidity balancing itself without effort, air flowing calmly instead of rushing in drafts, all of it combining into a kind of thermal stillness where comfort lasted without constant intervention. Families living in these cabins would describe waking up to a home that felt as if it had protected them through the night, a home that didn't empty itself of warmth as soon as the fire died, but carried the memory of the burn in its mass, holding on to that energy as if cradling it, releasing it slowly so mornings felt gentle rather than abrupt. And this continuity gave them something priceless. Imagine going to sleep in a room where the walls themselves seem to hum with stored heat, where the light from a fire hours old still lingers as a whisper of warmth along the planks, where your feet touch a floor that feels like sun-warmed stone, not because a machine is running, but because the building itself is acting like a reservoir of energy, and as the cold outside deepens, the cabin simply exhales warmth back into your space at exactly the rate your body needs. There is a kind of peace in that, a slow, reassuring peace, the kind that makes you understand why so many people who restore these old cabins report sleeping better in them, waking more rested, feeling less dryness in winter, feeling fewer temperature spikes across the night, and sensing, even without scientific explanation, that these structures are operating on a different logic. It is the logic of thermal mass and natural materials, a logic that doesn't chase temperature but absorbs it, carries it, releases it with perfect timing, and this kind of comfort cannot be rushed, cannot be manufactured through thin walls and constant airflow, because true warmth takes time to build, and medieval builders understood this as instinctively as they understood the length of winter itself. And as more researchers revisit these ancient heating systems, they keep discovering that medieval people were not simply reacting to the cold, they were mastering it, turning fire, wood, stone, and air into a unified system that didn't just heat a home but regulated it, like a natural ecosystem designed to protect its inhabitants. Some architects now see these principles not as relics of the past but as essential lessons for the future, especially as energy grids become strained, as storms intensify, as temperatures swing more violently, and as people search for ways to build homes that don't collapse into discomfort the moment a power line goes down. Because resilience, true resilience, isn't about having the newest furnace or the most advanced thermostat. It's about building structures that hold their own, structures that keep people warm even when systems fail, structures that make comfort possible without constant energy. And the old log cabins prove that this has already been done before, with nothing more than local materials, careful placement, and an understanding of how heat really behaves. And maybe, as you listen to this, you begin to sense how much knowledge was left behind, not because it was outdated, but because it was slow, careful, and based on a kind of deep, patient wisdom that doesn't fit easily into modern schedules, the kind of wisdom that builds homes to last centuries instead of decades, that sees winter not as an enemy, but as a rhythm to be balanced, that trusts the materials of the earth to do the work machines now struggle to replicate. And in that realization, the story of medieval heating becomes something more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a reminder that comfort, safety, and warmth do not always require complexity, and that simplicity, when aligned with physics, can outlast even the most advanced modern systems. And as this understanding deepens, something else becomes clear. These medieval systems weren't simply methods of heating a structure, they were expressions of a worldview in which homes were built not to fight nature, but to harmonize with it, to bend with its forces, to store its energy, to use its rhythms rather than resist them. And in this partnership between humans and the environment, there was a quiet intelligence, one that treated heat not as something to be blasted into a room, but as something to be captured, nurtured, circulated, and preserved. Because when you step into a modern home with thin walls and forced air heating, you immediately feel a kind of tension in the temperature, a push and pull as the furnace turns on, rushes hot air through vents, shuts off again, and leaves behind an uneven patchwork of warm pockets near the ceiling and cool drafts near the floor. And your body responds to these fluctuations instinctively, tightening muscles, constricting blood vessels, signaling that something is unstable even if the thermostat insists the room is warm. But inside an old log cabin, The warmth does not arrive in bursts. It radiates slowly from the floor, moves gently through the mass of the walls, fills corners that would otherwise remain cold, and lingers long after the fire burns out, creating a continuity that the human nervous system recognizes as safety. Not intense heat, not artificial blasts, but steady, enveloping comfort that mirrors natural gradients found in sunlit rocks or warm soil. This slow release of heat is what made these cabins so effective during the coldest nights, because instead of relying on continuous energy input, they relied on the memory of warmth stored in their structure, a kind of thermal inertia that kept temperatures stable even when outside conditions plunged suddenly, smoothing the line between day and night, between fire and silence, between warmth created and warmth preserved. And this memory extended to moisture as well, because wooden walls, floors, and ceilings absorbed humidity when the air became too damp and released it when the air became too dry, balancing the atmosphere in a way modern HVAC systems try to mimic with separate humidifiers and dehumidifiers, all of which consume energy, require maintenance, and still struggle to achieve the same natural softness that wood accomplishes effortlessly. People who live in these old cabins often describe waking up without that dry scratchiness in their throat, without static shocks, without the discomfort of parched skin that modern winter air brings. And they say the air feels rounder, softer, or simply more natural, and these sensations match perfectly with scientific findings, showing that indoor humidity in log cabins remains within the healthy range almost entirely on its own. Even the air quality improves in ways that seem almost magical, until you realize the science behind it. Because wood fiber absorbs volatile organic compounds, the invisible chemicals released by new paint, adhesives, carpets, furniture, and cleaning products, capturing them and holding them within its structure, effectively filtering the air without fans or filters, and making the indoor environment cleaner than many modern homes equipped with mechanical purifiers. This subtle filtration, combined with the humidity balance and the slow radiant warmth, creates an environment where people simply feel better, where sleep comes more easily, where breathing feels smoother, and where the cold outside seems to lose some of its harshness, as if the home itself is softening the winter at every possible point of contact. And once you begin to see all of these systems as parts of a single whole, the medieval cabin transforms from a quaint relic into a highly refined piece of engineering, perfected not through textbooks but through centuries of trial, error, and survival. Each family adjusting the design slightly, each winter teaching builders something new, until the structure became a living encyclopedia of what works in cold climates. It is remarkable, truly, that something built 200 years ago using only hand tools and local materials can outperform structures built today, with advanced modeling software, complex codes, and industrial insulation. Yet the evidence is overwhelming. When the grid fails, when temperatures drop, when storms cut off heating systems, the medieval cabin remains warm, stable, and breathable, while modern homes begin to lose livability almost immediately. And that contrast forces us to ask deeper questions about the future, questions about how we build, what we prioritize, and whether speed and efficiency have caused us to forget principles that kept generations alive, not through wealth or technology, but through understanding, patience, and the slow refinement of designs that respected both human physiology and natural physics. Perhaps the most comforting part of this entire story is the realization that nothing about these systems is lost forever. The knowledge still exists, still measurable, still visible in the thermal scans of cabins like Helmer's, still preserved in the surviving masonry heaters of Russia and Finland, still embedded in the floors, walls, and entryways of structures that have endured more winters than any of us ever will. And that means the lessons are still here, waiting quietly for anyone who wants to listen. Builders who want to design homes that remain warm without power, families who want comfort that doesn't depend on constant energy, architects who want to create resilience through simplicity rather than complexity, and even people like you, listening now, simply wanting to understand how humans once made the cold Instead of starting with the same gentle reflection, let's step into a different angle. Imagine for a moment the silence that fills a cabin long after midnight, the kind of deep, settling silence that only winter can create, when snow absorbs every distant sound and the walls, thick with stored warmth, stand quietly through the dark hours, doing their work without being asked. In that silence, you begin to notice something subtle, the absence of the mechanical hums and clicks that define modern houses, the way air handlers switch on, the way furnaces roar briefly then fall silent, the way thermostats click and relay systems pulse warm air through vents. None of that exists here. Instead, the warmth inside the room feels as though it has been released slowly, almost thoughtfully by the walls themselves, as if they're exhaling the fire they absorbed earlier in the day. And it's in moments like these, with the fire long gone and the night at its coldest, that the true brilliance of medieval heating becomes most obvious. The floor is still warm, radiating a steady, gentle heat that rises just enough to keep your body comfortable without ever feeling overpowering. The corners of the room, normally the coldest places in a modern home, remain remarkably pleasant because the heater was placed exactly where modern builders never think to put it, tucked into an interior corner that slowly transformed the coldest point of the room into a reservoir of stable, lingering warmth. If you were to reach out and rest your hand on the thick log wall, you'd feel something unexpected, not the sharp chill that modern walls develop overnight, but a faint, enduring warmth, the evidence of heat stored deep in the material, resisting the pull of the freezing air outside. Modern construction simply can't mimic this, because thin walls filled with insulation resist heat loss, but can't store anything. They cool as quickly as the air around them cools, leaving the home vulnerable to every dip in temperature. But the medieval cabin you're imagining right now doesn't respond to the cold that way. Its walls release stored energy on their own slow schedule, smoothing out the edges of the night's harshest temperatures, keeping the interior environment steady, predictable, and calming. You don't wake up freezing. You don't feel the sudden sting of cold air at 3 in the morning. Instead, the temperature drifts so gradually that your body barely notices the shift. Even more interesting is how these systems, though simple in materials, were incredibly sophisticated in function. The floor beneath you isn't warm because a pipe is pumping heated water through it. It's warm because 20 inches of sand, clay, and stone stored the day's heat like a battery, releasing it slowly as the night deepens. The air around you isn't dry and irritating, because the wood that forms the entire structure is managing humidity naturally, absorbing moisture when it becomes too high and releasing it when it becomes too low. This means the cabin doesn't just stay warm, it stays balanced in temperature, in humidity, in air quality, without any electricity, without any mechanical systems, without any digital controls monitoring the environment minute by minute. And maybe the part that fascinates researchers most is not that these systems work, but that they have worked for centuries, unchanged, unaltered, performing as reliably today as they did when they were first built. The cabins that remain standing prove the endurance of this knowledge, the quiet persistence of a design philosophy based on careful observation rather than speed, and every thermal scan, every humidity test, every airflow measurement confirms what the builders centuries ago already knew through lived experience. Even now, in an era of smart thermostats and energy-efficient appliances, there is something astonishingly powerful about the idea that a home could keep you warm through the coldest night simply because the materials remember the day's fire, that a wall could breathe moisture in and out like a living organism, that corners could be warmed deliberately to prevent mold generations before anyone understood the biology behind it. And when you let these ideas settle softly into your mind, especially in a quiet moment like this, you realize just how much comfort can be created, not by complexity, but by alignment. Aligning with physics, with the seasons, with the natural behavior of heat and air, creating a home that supports you without demanding anything in return. There's another way to look at all of this, one that becomes clearer the more you study these old structures. Medieval builders weren't simply reacting to cold climates. They were designing homes that anticipated the cold, homes that absorbed the rhythms of winter, and turned them into advantages rather than obstacles. And nowhere is this more evident than in the way these cabins respond to long periods without heat. Modern homes lose warmth quickly, the moment the furnace shuts down, dropping several degrees in an hour, falling to uncomfortable levels in just a few more, and within half a day becoming environments where breath turns visible and water pipes begin to freeze. But in a log cabin with proper mass, a single fire, just 2 hours of burning, can sustain livable temperatures for nearly an entire day, because the heat isn't merely trapped in the air, it's locked in the structure itself. Those thick walls, that heavy floor, that central masonry heater, together they form something like a vast thermal reservoir, a silent power bank hidden inside the bones of the building, collecting energy every time a fire burns, and releasing it long after the flames have died. During a sudden cold snap, instead of plunging into discomfort, the home gently shifts, very slowly, its temperature drifting downward in a calm, predictable curve rather than collapsing. And this slow decline isn't just physically comfortable, it's psychologically calming, because your body senses that the environment is stable, that the cold is not rushing in, that the home is protecting you. And what's even more remarkable is how naturally all of this happens. Nothing needs to be monitored. Nothing needs to be adjusted. There are no switches, no sensors, no motors humming in the walls. The materials do the work themselves, acting according to properties they've always had. The density of wood, the specific heat of sand, the mass of brick, the slow expansion and contraction of natural materials as they store and release energy. In the morning, when a new fire is lit, the entire structure drinks in the heat again, building up its reserves for the next cycle. This creates a daily rhythm that families once moved through intuitively. A morning fire to charge the home, a warm afternoon as the mass radiates heat, a gentle evening where the air stays comfortable, even as the fire dies, and a night where the warmth slowly unwinds through the structure, carrying you until morning without a single additional log. It's a beautiful kind of simplicity, not primitive, not outdated, but timeless in its efficiency and elegance. And the deeper you go, the more you realize how seamlessly these systems interact with one another. The warm floor keeps your body relaxed even when the air temperature drifts slightly lower. The stable humidity prevents dryness and discomfort, making the room feel warmer at lower temperatures. The airlock stops sudden blasts of winter from resetting the thermal balance. The corner heater radiates heat into every useful surface instead of losing it through an outside wall. The massive logs smooth out temperature spikes, so the entire home stays within a comfortable range without constant fuel. Each part supports the others, reducing weaknesses, reinforcing strengths, creating something much closer to a self-regulating environment than anything produced by modern forced air systems. These homes don't chase comfort, they maintain it. And the most surprising part is this. When modern engineers finally study these ancient principles with modern tools, they don't find superstition or luck. They find physics, beautifully applied physics, refined over centuries by builders who learn not from textbooks but from winters, from experience, from the wisdom passed down in families who depended on these designs for survival. It makes you wonder how many other solutions from the past hold power we've forgotten, and how many ideas still lie hidden in old timber walls, waiting patiently for someone to look closely again, just like those Finnish researchers did when they stepped into Helm's cabin and saw a system more effective than almost anything we build today. What becomes almost impossible to ignore, once you understand all these interconnected systems, is how profoundly different the experience of winter must have felt for the people who lived in these cabins. Not easier. No one would pretend that pre-industrial winters were gentle, but more predictable, more stable, carried by the rhythm of homes that held on to warmth, rather than leaking it in frantic cycles the way modern structures do. Picture a long Scandinavian night in the early 1800s. the kind where darkness stretches endlessly and temperatures fall so low that trees outside crack with a sharp echo as the sap inside them freezes. Inside the cabin, the fire that burned at dawn has long since faded, yet the room remains steady, not warm in a luxurious sense, but warm in a living sense. The kind of warmth that wraps around the body softly, allowing sleep to be deep and uninterrupted. There's a simplicity here that almost feels like wisdom. No furnace roaring to life, no air vents rattling, no thermostat clicking, just the quiet weight of the home doing exactly what it was built to do. And this natural stability doesn't just affect comfort. It affects behavior, daily habits, the way families used their space. Rooms in these cabins were arranged around the heater, not for decoration but for function. Sleeping platforms were placed near the masonry core, where the radiant heat would be strongest through the night. Floorboards were chosen and fitted carefully because they weren't just a surface to walk on. They were part of the heating system, part of the home's memory. Even the airlock, that small unheated room at the entrance, wasn't merely architectural convenience. It shaped routines. Boots and coats were removed there, snow was shaken off there, and the cabin's interior was kept pristine, not because anyone was obsessed with cleanliness, but because that little buffer zone protected everything inside from the shock of winter rushing through the door. And then there was the way the heater itself dictated the home's layout. In modern houses, the fireplace is often placed for aesthetics, central for show or along an outside wall because it looks right, but medieval builders made no such compromises. They put the heater exactly where it could radiate heat most efficiently, in a protected interior corner, touching no exterior surfaces, losing no warmth to the outside. This small, almost invisible decision meant that every brick in that structure contributed to warming the interior, and none of it was wasted. The heater became the heart of the home, not just metaphorically but physically, radiating heat evenly into adjacent rooms, down into the floor, and across the mass of the walls. It eliminated cold corners, those dreaded pockets of still air that modern homes struggle with, because the warmest object in the building sat precisely where coldness would otherwise collect. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost sense what that must have felt like, lying down to sleep near a wall that is gently warm to the touch, hearing the faint tick of settling wood as the cabin releases the last of the day's heat, breathing air that feels neither dry nor damp but perfectly balanced, the kind of air that doesn't irritate your throat, doesn't sting your nose, doesn't weigh down your lungs. It is the kind of environment that lets the body unwind fully, where muscles soften, breathing deepens, and the mind feels held, not in luxury, but in stability. This stability is what modern buildings struggle to create, even with advanced materials and constant electricity. The reliance on thin walls, rapid heating, and reactive systems means the indoor environment is always shifting, always trying to catch up with changes outside, always fighting physics instead of working with it. Medieval cabins, on the other hand, simply accepted the rules of nature and used them. They captured heat when it was available, stored it in heavy materials, released it slowly, stabilized humidity, softened airflow, and sealed themselves against sudden intrusions of cold, not through technology but through design that understood time, mass, and the slow dance of heat. And maybe that's why these cabins continue to fascinate researchers, architects, and anyone who steps inside one today, because they reveal a version of home that feels more like a sanctuary, something that doesn't demand energy but gives it back, something that doesn't rely on systems that hum and buzz, but on materials that rest in silence. There's a particular moment just before dawn when the genius of these old cabins becomes most obvious, that fragile slice of time when the fire has been out for hours, the world outside is still locked in darkness and ice, and yet the air inside the cabin feels gently alive, not warm in a luxurious way, but warm in the way a quiet hand feels on your shoulder, steady and reassuring. If you were to walk across the floor at that hour, your feet wouldn't recoil from freezing boards the way they do in modern houses. Instead, they'd find a lingering warmth rising softly from the mass beneath, heat stored deep within layers of sand and clay, released with a rhythm so slow and natural that the body adapts without even noticing. It is the kind of warmth that doesn't startle or spike. It simply exists, a gentle presence woven into the structure of the home. This morning moment also reveals something else. How differently these cabins release their heat depending on the season. In winter, the thick log walls slowly exhale the warmth they stored during the previous day's fire, keeping the interior at a steady temperature long after the flames have disappeared. But in summer, those exact same walls absorb heat without passing it through quickly, creating a cool interior that resists the midday sun, proving that thermal mass is not just a winter advantage, it's a full-year system of temperature moderation. Modern homes, with their lightweight walls and hollow construction, cannot do this. They heat up quickly under sun, cool rapidly when temperatures drop, and rely entirely on mechanical systems to mediate the difference. But a log cabin moderates seasonal shifts by its very nature, acting almost like a sponge for heat, soaking up excess warmth during hot periods and releasing it slowly during cold ones. This is why researchers often describe these structures as thermal machines built without machines. Because every piece of the home, every log, every stone, every brick, participates actively in regulating the interior climate. There is no wasted material. Nothing is merely decorative. Every decision in the design serves a functional purpose, from the thickness of the planks to the height of the hearth to the angle where two walls meet. And there is something deeply soothing in the idea that these materials work continuously, even while you sleep. They don't need commands. They don't need electricity. They don't stop because of a storm. They simply follow the laws of physics in ways that modern construction rarely harnesses, creating comfort, not through automation but through alignment with nature. Consider the way humidity behaves in these spaces. In modern homes, cold winter air heated by furnaces becomes bone dry, pulling moisture from skin, eyes, and airways, making the home feel harsh even when the thermostat reads a comfortable number. Yet in a log cabin, the wood itself acts like a regulator. When the air grows too dry, the logs release moisture. When the air becomes too damp, they absorb it. This prevents the air from veering into the extremes that cause discomfort, static electricity, dryness, condensation, and maintains a natural balance without any mechanical system humming in the background. It's no wonder that people describe the air in these homes as fresh, soft, or clean, and this is not imagination, it's chemistry. Wood absorbs volatile organic compounds, binding them inside its fibers and removing them from the air you breathe. No filters, no fans. Just the silent work of a natural material interacting with its environment as it has for centuries. But perhaps the most impressive part of all is that none of these effects require ongoing knowledge or effort from the people living in the cabin. Once the home is built, it functions. Once the materials are in place, they perform. These systems don't degrade when the electricity goes out, don't panic during blizzards, don't rely on constant adjustment. They simply continue. Imagine living in a place where your comfort doesn't depend on whether the grid stays on, where a sudden ice storm doesn't send the temperature inside your home plunging, where the architecture itself cushions you from nature's volatility. This was the normal experience for the people who lived in these cabins, and it can feel almost startling to modern minds accustomed to houses that lose all livability within hours of a power outage. And as the horizon begins to brighten in that early morning moment, the faintest shimmer of pale blue light shining through frost-lined windows, you can feel the truth of these designs in the way your breath moves, in the calmness of the air, in the steadiness of the room. The fire can be relit when you choose, but the cabin has already done its part through the night, protecting you with knowledge carved into its very structure. Another detail that often goes unnoticed, yet was absolutely essential to medieval comfort, is the way these homes controlled air movement. Because warmth alone doesn't create a sense of safety or coziness if the air inside the room is constantly shifting, pulling cold drafts across your ankles or letting warm bursts rise too abruptly toward the ceiling. Modern homes suffer from this constantly. The furnace switches on, air rushes through vents, A pocket of heat forms near the ceiling, and then minutes later the system shuts off, leaving the lower parts of the room to cool again. But inside a heavy log cabin, air behaves differently. The mass of the home slows the entire cycle of convection, dampening the turbulence that modern homes never seem to avoid. The air doesn't swirl, it doesn't pulse in waves, instead it moves in long, slow currents, rising gently from the warm masonry heater, sweeping softly across the ceiling, dropping toward the walls, and then settling in the center of the room like a warm, steady breath. This kind of air movement is almost impossible to replicate artificially, yet it shapes the feeling of comfort more powerfully than most people realize. When air is too turbulent, the body senses instability. When it shifts too quickly from warm to cool, your muscles tense, your skin tightens, and your mind stays slightly alert, even if you don't consciously understand why. But in a room where temperature transitions are smooth and gradual, the body relaxes deeply, allowing you to rest, to sleep, to breathe without resistance. Think of how it feels to sit near a campfire after sunset. The warmth radiates steadily, evenly, sinking into your clothes and into your skin, without any sudden spikes or drops. This is the same kind of radiant stability the cabin recreated indoors, amplified by thick walls and dense floors that acted like anchors against fluctuations. And this stability wasn't just physical, it influenced daily life in ways modern people rarely think about. Families could place beds near the heater because the warmth wasn't dangerous or overwhelming. Children could play on the floor because it never turned icy cold. People could wake before dawn and walk barefoot without discomfort. Even tasks like cooking or preparing food were made easier by air that didn't dry out ingredients or cause rapid cooling during meal preparation. There's also something incredibly comforting about the way these cabins resisted the psychological stress of winter. In many modern homes, people describe feeling on edge during long cold spells, not because of temperature alone, but because the environment never quite settles. Heating systems cycle, air shifts, humidity drops, noises echo through hollow walls. But inside a log cabin, the quiet heaviness of the structure creates a sense of groundedness, as if the home is absorbing not just heat but tension. You can imagine what it must have felt like for families centuries ago to gather near the masonry heater at night, watching the last embers dim, knowing that even after the flames were gone, the walls and floors would continue protecting them. Outside, the wind might whip snow against the logs, the trees might groan under the weight of frost, but inside the air stayed soft, the temperature stayed steady, and the home itself seemed to stand guard. And when storms arrived, the kind that today send entire cities scrambling for generators, these cabins responded with quiet confidence. The fire might go out, the wind might shake the shutters, but the structure held its warmth for hours, even days, buying families precious time. This wasn't a lucky accident. It was the result of centuries of refinement of builders who learned from every winter how to create homes that didn't collapse at the first sign of strain. These old designs weren't perfect, of course. They required effort, chopping wood, tending the fire, maintaining the structure. But what they offered in return was something nearly priceless: independence from fragile systems, comfort that didn't require constant energy, and a kind of peace that comes from knowing your home is not working against nature, but moving alongside it. And perhaps this is why, even today, people who spend time in these cabins describe an almost immediate change in the way they feel: calmer, sleepier, more grounded, as though the house's slow rhythms begin to influence their own, softening the edges of the day and smoothing out the sharpness of winter. One of the most surprising realizations once you begin studying these old log cabins closely is that their effectiveness isn't tied to any single feature. Not the walls, not the heater, not the floor, but to the timing with which all of these elements release their stored energy. Modern heating floods a space with warmth quickly, and then cuts off abruptly, forcing the environment into constant cycles. The medieval cabin, however, releases heat on a timescale closer to the natural world, slow, steady, predictable. This timing matters more than it first appears. When heat is released slowly, the body adjusts effortlessly, never startled into goosebumps or flushed by sudden warmth. When humidity shifts gradually, the air remains comfortable without ever crossing into the dryness that plagues forced air systems. When the temperature in a room changes at the pace of stone or wood rather than the flick of a switch, the nervous system relaxes, recognizing that it doesn't need to brace itself against abrupt shifts. In a sense, these homes create their own internal climate, one that remains remarkably stable regardless of what happens outside. This is perhaps the greatest contrast with modern buildings. Modern construction shields you from the elements only as long as electricity flows, while medieval buildings slow the elements themselves, transforming temperature swings into slow curves rather than violent spikes. Consider how this feels over the course of a day. At sunrise, the thick logs on the sun-facing wall begin to absorb warmth immediately, storing it deep inside their mass. The heater, lit in the morning, charges the floor and the core of the home. By afternoon, the home has collected enough energy to last deep into the evening. As night settles, the walls release the day's warmth gently, while the floor offers a soft, radiant glow that keeps bare feet warm even when the air has cooled slightly. By midnight, there's still heat left in the structure, not the sharp heat of flame, but the even, restful warmth of stored energy. And because this cycle repeats every day, the home rarely experiences the shock of sudden cold. Even if the fire isn't lit for a long period, the house doesn't crash into discomfort the way lightweight modern homes do. Cold air might press against the outside, but the interior responds slowly, its massive materials resisting the urge to drop quickly. This is why families who lived in these cabins rarely woke up shivering. Even in the harshest winters, their homes didn't demand constant attention. They partnered with the rhythms of daily life. A morning fire, a closed airlock, a midday burst of sunlight through a small window, all of these contributed to a thermal cycle that made winter less punishing and more predictable. Another part of the magic lies in the cabin's geometry. Because the heater sits in an interior corner, the warmth radiates into the room in a wide, even pattern rather than leaking out through an external wall. Every surface warmed by the heater becomes another source of radiant heat. The floor, the adjacent logs, even the ceiling beams, creating layers of warmth that overlap subtly throughout the space. Modern homes, by comparison, often fight their own design. Heat rises too quickly in pools near the ceiling. Walls remain cold and steal warmth from your body. Doors invite blasts of freezing air into the living room the moment they open. The house becomes a battlefield of temperature differences, and every hour the furnace must correct these imbalances at the cost of energy and noise. But in the old cabins, the design prevents imbalance. Cold air is caught in the airlock. Heat is distributed through mass rather than forced air. Walls and floors radiate at different rates, smoothing out extremes. Even corners, the coldest zones in modern rooms, remain warm because the heater warms them directly. Every part of the design contributes to one simple outcome: consistency. And consistency is the key to comfort. It's what allows a person to sleep deeply. It's what prevents sudden waking in the night. It's what makes a home feel safe, quiet, and gentle even during the fiercest blizzards. In a world where we often chase comfort through technology, it's humbling to realize that people centuries ago achieved a kind of warmth we still struggle to reproduce today. Not through machines, but through understanding, through patience, and through an intimate relationship with the materials that surrounded them. What becomes even more fascinating, the deeper you examine these cabins, is how every part of the structure serves more than one purpose, almost as if medieval builders didn't just design homes, but designed systems, interconnected, interdependent, quietly intelligent systems that solved multiple problems at once without ever needing mechanical complexity. Take the logs themselves. At first glance, they're simply structural elements, walls that hold up a roof, but as you spend more time inside such a cabin, you start to understand that the logs are doing far more than providing shelter. They're storing energy from the morning fire, moderating humidity, absorbing and releasing warmth in perfect rhythm, filtering the air, and even dampening sound so that winter nights feel calmer and more insulated from the outside world. A single log might weigh hundreds of pounds, and inside that weight is a reservoir of thermal capacity that modern drywall simply cannot replicate. When heat touches the surface of a thick, seasoned timber, it doesn't merely bounce off or slip through. It sinks in, diffusing slowly through the wood's fibers, embedding itself as potential energy that the home will draw upon long after the flames fade. This is why the walls of these old cabins feel warm to the touch hours after the fire has died, and why the air around them maintains such softness and stability. Even the corner joints, those interlocking notches carved by hand, contribute to temperature regulation. Their design minimizes air leakage, reduces drafts, and ensures that the home breathes slowly and steadily, rather than in sudden gusts. Every detail, even those that appear decorative to modern eyes, participates in the choreography of heat, how it enters the home, how it moves, how it stays. But perhaps the element with the most understated power is the floor. In modern houses, floors are an afterthought. Thin surfaces laid over hollow spaces that fill with cold air, turning winter mornings into a shock the moment your feet touch the ground. But in the medieval cabin, the floor was a deliberate, essential part of the heating system. It carried weight, literally and figuratively, with its deep layers of stone, sand, clay, and wide planks working together to trap the day's warmth like a slow-burning ember. This is why the Finnish researchers were so astonished when they pointed their thermal camera downward and saw the floor glowing brighter than the ceiling. Heat didn't escape upward into the rafters the way it does in modern homes. It settled, stayed, sank into the mass beneath the boards, and returned to the room gradually, ensuring that the most important part of the home, the place where feet, legs, and bodies connect with the ground, remained the warmest. It reverses everything we expect. Instead of burning energy to heat the top of the room first, the cabin places warmth where the human body is most sensitive, at ground level, creating comfort from the bottom up rather than the top down. This bottom-up warmth does more than keep toes comfortable. It signals to the brain that the environment is safe, that the cold outside is not invading, that the body does not need to constrict blood flow or tighten muscles, allowing deep relaxation that modern heating systems often fail to achieve, even at higher temperatures. And while all these components, walls, floors, corners, entryways, operate quietly inside the cabin, the outside world experiences them differently. Snow piled against the external logs melts just enough to create a thin, insulating layer of ice. The roof sheds frost slowly, releasing small wisps of heat instead of large waves. The chimney remains cool to the touch, a sign that almost none of the fire's energy is being wasted. These clues, subtle as they are, would have told any observer from centuries past that the home was performing exactly as intended, holding in heat, resisting wind, managing airflow, and returning warmth in steady, measured doses. Modern buildings, by comparison, leak heat aggressively. Snow melts rapidly along roof edges, creating ice dams. Chimneys radiate enormous amounts of wasted warmth. Drafts creep under doors and through walls, and the constant cycle of heating and cooling puts strain on both the system and the people living inside it. But the medieval cabin, with its slower, steadier rhythms, protects its occupants almost instinctively. Even if the fire is forgotten or delayed, the structure buys time, hours of comfort, sometimes an entire day, before the interior temperature starts to decline noticeably. There's something deeply reassuring about that, especially in a world where so much depends on technology working perfectly every moment. These cabins offer a different kind of comfort, one rooted in patience, mass, material, and the quiet intelligence of design tested by centuries of winter storms. What's striking when you step back and look at the medieval cabin as a whole is that it doesn't behave like a modern house at all. It behaves more like a landscape, a small self-regulating environment that reacts to heat and cold the way a forest or a hillside would, slowly, predictably, with layers of response that unfold over hours rather than minutes. Think about how a forest holds warmth after sunset. The ground releases the day's heat long after the air cools. The bark of trees retains warmth even when the wind grows sharp. Stones near the base of old pines stay warm enough to melt patches of snow. Everything in nature stores heat with a patience that no machine can imitate quickly. The old cabin works exactly the same way, storing, releasing, balancing, with each material performing a role shaped by centuries of observation. Inside, you might notice how the temperature has a certain weight to it, a sense of thickness that modern heating systems rarely produce. Forced air systems warm air but not the objects around you, which means a room can feel warm while the walls, floors, and furniture remain cold, creating a strange disconnect that your body picks up immediately. But in a log cabin, the surfaces themselves hold warmth, and this radiant heat is what truly makes a room feel cozy. It wraps around you from all directions, not just from vents in the ceiling or a single heater on the wall. This is why people sleeping in these cabins describe feeling enveloped rather than simply warmed. The home radiates heat like a natural body, steady and quiet. Even the smell of the cabin contributes to this sense of comfort. Modern homes often smell dry, metallic, or chemically clean because of paints, sealants, plastics, and synthetic carpets. But a log cabin smells of wood warmed gently over decades. Resin, bark, old smoke, and just a hint of clay or stone, scents that instinctively calm the human mind, because they're tied to natural materials and slow processes. Researchers studying cabin environments found that wood absorbs not only moisture but also chemical pollutants, meaning the air inside becomes cleaner over time, not just filtered or sanitized momentarily. Each year the home stands, it becomes better at maintaining a healthy interior climate. Imagine that. A house that improves with age, with no machinery to maintain, no filters to replace, no alarms to set. And all of this leads to an experience of winter that feels fundamentally different from what most people know. Instead of racing from one source of heat to another, instead of layering blankets against walls that radiate cold, instead of waking at night when the furnace cycles off, you move through the day in a space that feels consistent. Winter becomes something happening outside, not inside. It's almost unbelievable how much this changes the human experience of the season. Children in these homes could play barefoot on wooden floors even in deep winter. Elderly people slept without fear of waking up cold if the fire burned down. Families felt a kind of security that didn't rely on timers, thermostats, or fuel deliveries. And even in the worst snowstorms, the house itself reacted with a quiet resilience, holding heat, slowing the cold, protecting its occupants until morning. This wasn't luxury. It wasn't convenience. It was survival shaped into comfort, one piece of knowledge at a time. But beyond the physical stability lies something even more compelling. The emotional stability these cabins created. The slow, predictable environment calmed the nervous system. The soft nightly warmth encouraged deeper sleep. The consistent humidity helped breathing. The quiet heaviness of the structure reduced anxiety. People didn't describe these cabins as efficient or innovative. They described them as good to live in. Gentle, trustworthy. These were human descriptions, not technical ones. A sign that the architecture wasn't just functional but deeply aligned with human comfort. Today, researchers look at thermal graphs, humidity charts, and airflow models, and realize that the medieval builders accomplished, purely through intuition and iteration, what modern engineering still struggles to achieve: a home that remains comfortable, even when the world outside becomes dangerous. And maybe that's the real point, that these cabins offer a reminder, whispered across centuries, that comfort doesn't have to be complicated, and that sometimes the most advanced solutions are the ones we abandoned when we forgot how long winter truly is. One aspect that often surprises people, once they step inside one of these centuries-old cabins, is how quietly confident the building feels. almost as if it knows exactly what it was built to do. Modern homes seem nervous by comparison, always humming, always adjusting, always switching systems on and off in rapid bursts of correction. But the old cabin simply stands there, heavy and steady, holding the warmth it has stored, releasing it at its own unhurried pace. If you sit still for a moment inside such a space, you begin to notice how the environment behaves more like a slow river than like a machine. There are no sharp changes, no sudden pockets of cold air, no rushing currents of heat climbing the walls. Everything moves in gradients, subtle shifts that the body senses not as transitions, but as continuity, a quiet flow of warmth that passes through the room like a tide. This gentle flow is shaped by the materials themselves. Thick logs slow down the transfer of heat, releasing it evenly across hours rather than minutes. The masonry core radiates warmth like a sleeping animal, steady and rhythmic. The packed clay under the floor offers a slow upward drift of heat that rewards anyone who walks barefoot, each step sinking into a warmth that feels older than the morning fire itself. And even the cold outside, sharp, brutal, merciless in winter, is softened by the cabin's design. Instead of rushing into the living space the moment the door opens, the cold is caught in the airlock, held there like a breath between breaths, allowed to settle before you step further inside. This small buffer room, simple and unheated, provides a psychological comfort that modern homes often lack, because there is no sudden shock of winter invading your sanctuary. Inside, the logs continue their quiet work on a particularly harsh night. Frost may cling to the outside surface of the walls, glittering under moonlight, but inside you feel none of that sharpness. The thermal mass insulates you from the drama outside, allowing the interior to remain calm even when the temperature swings wildly. It's the architectural equivalent of someone placing a warm hand on your shoulder and saying, "You're safe here." Even the arrangement of rooms reflects this philosophy of calm resilience. Medieval cabins often place sleeping areas on raised platforms built onto or near the masonry heater, allowing the family to rest in the warmest part of the home. These platforms retained heat long into the night because the mass beneath them radiated steadily. Children slept closest to the core, wrapped in the softest and warmest air, while adults slept slightly further away, following the natural thermal gradient of the room. It's a form of temperature zoning achieved without ducts, without thermostats, and without electricity, only physics and positioning. The family simply moved through the space in harmony with how warm each area naturally became. When storms hit, people often describe the experience inside these cabins as timeless. The wind may howl outside, snow may pile against the door, and the sky may darken into a swirling blur, but inside, the air remains heavy and warm. You hear the storm, but it doesn't reach you. The thick walls absorb the vibration, the heater radiates from its core, and the floor releases the heat trapped during the day. In modern homes, a power outage during a storm creates instant anxiety. In a medieval cabin, it barely matters. And perhaps the most charming part is how these structures age. Instead of degrading, they mature. Wood becomes denser over time. The joints tighten, the logs regulate humidity more effectively. The thermal performance stabilizes as the building settles into its final shape. Every winter makes the cabin a little wiser, a little more attuned to the climate, a little more capable of protecting those inside. Imagine living in a place that doesn't break down year after year, but improves, a home that learns quietly without you ever needing to teach it. As these ideas settle softly in your mind, you can almost sense why the Finnish researchers stood speechless in Helmi's cabin as the thermal camera revealed patterns they didn't expect. It wasn't just warmth they found, it was intelligence, built into every beam, every brick, every inch of floor. Something else becomes clear the longer you sit with these ideas. Medieval homes weren't built around the fire. They were built with the assumption that the fire would eventually go out. Modern houses behave as if heat will always be available, as if furnaces will never fail, and electricity will always flow. But medieval cabins were designed with the expectation that the flame would die, the embers would fade, and the home would still need to protect the people inside. This mindset shaped everything. It shaped the thickness of the walls, chosen not just for strength but for their ability to store the previous day's warmth like a memory. It shaped the position of the heater, protected in an interior corner so its warmth flowed into the home instead of leaking outdoors. It shaped the layered floor, built heavy and deep, not for decoration but for its ability to radiate heat back into the room long after the fire had gone cold. It shaped the airlock, a tiny room that stood between life and winter, catching the cold before it reached the living space. All of these choices were made with one purpose: to ensure the home would remain livable even in the absence of continuous fire. This is where the brilliance of the design truly shines. Medieval builders didn't rely on a constant heat source, because they knew constant heat wasn't guaranteed. They relied on mass, timing, and physics. It's a different philosophy of comfort altogether, one based on resilience rather than convenience. And you can feel that difference most clearly in the hours just before dawn, when the outside world is at its coldest. In a modern home, this is often the moment when rooms feel raw and chilly, when the furnace kicks on more frequently, when the air near the floor becomes so cold that your feet curl instinctively. But in a medieval cabin, those early hours feel surprisingly stable. The warmth stored in the walls and floors throughout the previous day releases itself at precisely the right pace to carry the home through the darkest stretch of night. There is a kind of quiet compassion in that, as if the cabin knows you are sleeping and adjusts itself to protect you. The walls don't rush when they release heat. They exhale slowly, giving back just enough energy to maintain comfort without ever overheating the space. The floor glows with a gentle warmth that doesn't spike with each burst of fire, but instead pulses with the memory of earlier flames. Even the air feels more grounded, held in place by the heavy materials that shaped the interior climate. Then, when morning comes and the first fire is lit again, the home doesn't require a massive surge of energy to recover. It simply absorbs the new heat, warms the structure evenly, and prepares to carry the family through another day. This cyclical partnership is remarkably efficient, but even more than that, it is soothing, a predictable pattern that humans naturally fall into. The home breathes in warmth during the day and breathes it out at night, and the family inside sleeps within that rhythm, almost like resting inside the slow heartbeat of the building itself. It is this partnership, more than any individual detail, that modern construction lost. Houses today are built as thin barriers, not participants. They resist nature, but do not work with it. And when the systems behind those barriers fail, during a winter storm, during a blackout, during a deep freeze, the home collapses into discomfort almost instantly. A medieval cabin never collapses suddenly. It drifts. It transitions. It changes slowly, predictably, almost respectfully. And because of that, people who live in these cabins describe a sense of trust in their homes, a feeling that the structure itself understands winter, understands survival, understands the cold in a way modern architecture simply does not. This trust matters. It changes how you feel, how you sleep, how you perceive winter's weight on the world outside. When your home holds the warmth for you, when it remembers the fire long after it has faded, when it releases heat with gentle patience, winter stops being something to fear and becomes something to endure with calmness. And so, as all these pieces settle into a single picture, the warm floor, the breathing walls, the patient masonry, the protective airlock, the quiet geometry of corners, the slow dance of heat within the home, you begin to understand why a 200-year-old cabin could keep an elderly woman comfortable through an 18-hour stretch without fire, while modern houses struggle to stay warm, even with thousands of dollars of annual heating. It was never magic. It was never guesswork. It was simply wisdom, the kind that comes from people who paid attention to winter, who respected what cold can do, who shaped wood and stone and clay into forms that worked with nature instead of fighting it, and who passed that knowledge down through generations until it became instinct. Somewhere along the way, In our rush to build faster, cheaper, and with more machinery, we walked away from that instinct. We replaced mass with hollow walls, replaced airlocks with single doors, replaced radiant warmth with forced air, replaced observation with speed, and in doing so, we lost systems that were not only efficient but profoundly human. Yet the cabins still stand. Their walls still breathe, their floors still glow softly at dawn. Their heaters still warm entire families with a single morning fire. Their air still feels gentle on the skin, and the quiet intelligence built into every surface still works just as precisely today as it did centuries ago. Perhaps that is the lasting lesson here, that good design doesn't age, it endures. And that comfort, true comfort, is not about overpowering winter with noise and machinery, but about understanding how heat wants to move, how the body wants to feel, how materials behave when left to do what they do best. In a world where storms can knock out power grids, where heating costs rise unpredictably, where modern houses become unlivable within hours of a blackout, the medieval cabin stands like a whisper from the past, reminding us that we once built homes that could protect us even when everything else failed. And maybe, as you drift towards sleep, letting the warmth of the blankets wrap around you, you can imagine yourself in such a home, the soft, radiant glow under your feet, the steady breath of warm wood in the air, the faint tick of settling logs, the quiet certainty that even if the fire goes out, the home will hold its warmth through the night. A structure that remembers the sun, remembers the fire, remembers the rhythm of winter. A home that doesn't panic when the cold settles in. A design we didn't need to reinvent, only to remember. Good night.